Здравствуйте, уважаемые участники международного проекта «Русский язык в Африке. Дорога и дружбы и сотрудничество». Мы приветствуем всех, кто присоединился к нам в прямом эфире на первой встрече культурно-просветительского цикла «Россия-Африка. Межкультурный диалог». Наш проект реализуется Центром дополнительного образования «Альфа-диалог» при поддержке Министерства просвещения Российской Федерации. Я рада приветствовать нашего первого спикера, кандидата исторических наук, старшего научного сотрудника Центра изучения российско-африканских отношений и внешней политики стран Африки Института Африки Российской академии наук Ольгу Сергеевну Кулькову на нашем первом занятии «Россия-Африка» по страницам истории и культуры. Напоминаю, что вы можете писать ваши вопросы и сообщения в чат трансляции. Мы постараемся на них ответить в конце встречи. Меня зовут Богданова Марина. Я приветствую вас из Санкт-Петербурга. Пожалуйста, напишите, из каких городов, из каких стран вы смотрите эту трансляцию. Наша встреча будет проходить на английском языке. Hello, dear participants of the international project, Russian language in Africa, the way of friendship and cooperation. We welcome everyone who joined our meeting. My name is Bogdanova Marina, and I'm the course coordinator of Alpha Dialogue Educational Center. The project is supported by the Ministry of Education of Russian Federation. Today is our first meeting, Russia-Africa through the pages of history and culture. And I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker, Olga Kulkova, the Senior Research Fellow of Institute of African Studies of Russian Academy of Science. And I remind you that you can write your questions and comment in our chat, and we will try to answer them at the end of the meeting. So we greet you from St. Petersburg, and Olga Sergeyevna greets you from Moscow. Please write in our web chat where you're watching this meeting from. And now I give the word to Olga Sergeyevna. Ольга Сергеевна, вам слово.
Да, здравствуйте. Слышно меня? Все хорошо, да?
Да.
Dear colleagues, dear guests, dear participants of the project, I would like to tell the most vivid pictures, the most vivid moments of the cooperation between Russia and Africa in the spheres of culture and science through the last two probably centuries. And first of all, I would like to start with Africa in the mirror of the Russian culture. And it is important to say that African continent has always attracted attention of Russian cultural figures like writers, poets, artists, and many of them made invaluable contribution in this aspect. For example, famous poet Valery Brusov, beginning of the 19th century, and Nobel laureate Joseph Brodsky, 20th century, wrote about Africa, and the image of Africa attracted them. And there were also Russian cultural figures who went to the real journeys to the African continent, like the writer and Nobel laureate Ivan Bunin, like artist Kuzma Petrov-Vodkin, like poets Mikhail Kuzmin and Nikolai Gumilev. And here on this slide, you see the reproduction of the picture by Kuzma Petrov-Vodkin from his travel to Africa. Now I would like to say a couple words about Ivan Bunin and his travels to Africa. He was to Egypt twice. For the first time, he spent only 3 days in 1907. He traveled first to the Holy Land, and then he decided to end up in the country of pyramids. In Cairo, with his wife, they saw the Egyptian Museum and stopped in Alexandria. The result of his first journey was a story written by him about Cairo, Light of the Zodiac. Then Bunin visited Egypt for the second time in 1911 and spent there a long 6 weeks. It was due to that he arrived in Port Said, and then he was ill. He had a stomach ache, and the doctor advised him to heal with Egyptian healing waters located in the vicinity of Cairo. So he spent almost 2 weeks working on the poems Cairo, Beyond the Tomb, Alexander in Egypt, and Tomb in the Rock. And in 1933, Bunin, living already in exile in Paris, received the Nobel Prize in Literature, awarded for the rigorous mastery with which he develops the traditions of the Russian classical prose. And it is important to say that Ivan Bunin was enchanted with Africa, enchanted with Cairo, and it is brilliantly described in his poems as well as in prose. Now I'd like to tell about poet Mikhail Kuzmin. He visited Alexandria and Cairo in his times. He was poet, but also prose writer, playwright, translator, critic, and even composer of the Silver Age of Russian culture and the first master of free verse in Russia. In 1893, he went on his first trip in his life, and in 2 years he visited Constantinople, Asia Minor, Greece, Alexandria, and Cairo. According to Kuzmin, there were a lot of impressions of the nature and culture that he was enchanted, almost intoxicated by them. And the climate of Africa and its nature never ceased to amaze him. However, his companion in the travel died, and it left imprint on his trip. But the result was brilliant. He wrote a very important and very famous cycle of poems called Alexandrian Songs, which was stylized as Alexandrian poetry of the Hellenistic era. The texts were included in his collection Networks and were generally recognized as a success. His work was valued both for its historicism and for its rhythmic solutions. And in general, it is important to say that there was a time of Egyptomania in Russian literature almost for a century and a half, from the end of the 18th century to the 20th of the 19th century. Russian poetry, prose, and dramaturgy have gone through the full cycle of comprehending this mysterious Egyptian civilization. And the Egyptian theme in Russian literature had a beginning, a peak, and an end. The origins of the Egyptian themes in Russian literature can be dated to the end of the 18th century, but neither ancient nor Islamic Egypt were practically not studied at that time, but the fashion for mystical Egypt reigned. The peak of Egyptomania came in the Silver Age of Russian culture, which developed a taste for elitist, academic, and esoteric topics. And its decline was in the 1920s. It was caused by the fact of the revolution of 1917, of the Civil War, and Soviet ideology, and then Iron Curtain. There were rare works about Egypt in 1930s, but they were mainly an echo of the already gone Silver Age. So the works of Bunin and Mikhail Kuzmin also represented these signs of Egyptomania in Russian literature. And it is important that during these 150 years, the Russian Egypt created its own palette, local colors, special vocabulary, plots borrowed from the Bible, Greek and Latin writers, ancient Egyptian history, and early Christianity, as well as the plots reflecting various aspects of Egyptomania, ancient Egyptian sphinxes and obelisks brought to modern cities, mummies, and so on. Also, I would like to introduce the image of Valery Brusov, a famous poet and writer. Though he never visited Africa, but he was very interested in the continent, and he wrote about the continent. Here you can see his quotes. He said that Europeans are completely wrong to think that Africa is a continent that can be robbed with impunity for entire centuries, and whose population in the 20th century can be kept in the position of slaves, as Belgians do in their Congo. We will soon hear another slogan, Africa for Blacks. So in fact, in the beginning of the 19th century, he foreseen the national liberation of African peoples. He also thought that Russian literature is in the best place to acknowledge peoples in the West and the East with the treasuries of the Russian culture. He said, if foreigners know anything about Russia, it is its literature. Until now, our literature has been our best representative in the West and in the East, and it must maintain its position in the future. Russian writers must ensure that they are read everywhere and that their voice testifies to the whole world about the importance of Russia and Russian people. Valery Brusov is known that it is not so well known, but he wrote a fantastic novel about Africa. He wrote it in 1899, but it was published only in 1975 for the first time. He wrote the novel Mountain of Star. It was his greatest fantasy work. Its plot was located in the unexplored regions of Central Africa. The main character finds a person who told him the secret. In the middle of inaccessible desert, there was a kingdom of the descendants of the Martians who arrived on Earth at the end of the 13th century. Of course, it is a fiction work, but nevertheless, its place of action was Africa. And Mountain of Star is one of a kind work by this famous Russian poet and writer. And it is very interesting. And it is a form of social utopia located in Africa. Now I would like to proceed and tell about the Kuzma Popov-Votkin, a famous artist who visited Tunisia and Algeria. In general, he traveled a lot to learn from the experience of other artists. He visited many European countries. And in July 1907, he went to North Africa. He visited Tunisia and Algeria. And during this journey, he created a large number of drawings, watercolors, and oil paintings. And based on the sketches he brought from his travels, in the second half of 1907 and early 1908, Popov-Votkin created several paintings, with which he later participated in 1908 Paris Autumn Salon, the exhibition. Then, having sent home everything he gained in France and North Africa, the artist went back to St. Petersburg, where he settled permanently. And in a letter to his mother, he noted, 2.5 months in Africa passed for me like a fabulous dream, and this impression will not be forgotten, and I feel that it was necessary and useful in terms of painting. I almost forgot gray paints. Because Africa with its bright colors impressed him a lot. And here you can see the examples of his paintings from Algeria and Tunisia. Here are also some examples. Another writer and poet, Russian writer and poet who visited Africa a lot was Nikolai Gumilev. He visited Africa 3 times, and the most complete evidence he left was the 4 chapters of his African diary. He wrote them on his last journey in 1913. According to him, preparations for the road took a whole month. Here on this photo, you can see him already in his travel to Abyssinia. During his trip, he was forced to save money because he was a bit short of money, but nevertheless, he managed to do a lot and visited many places in Abyssinia. He needed to collect samples of Abyssinian folk poetry. And in Abyssinia, this is modern Ethiopia, its capital Addis Ababa, he also tried to collect artifacts for the collection, including clothes. But some people believed he needed these clothes for witchcraft, and there is a legend that when he tried to take a photo of one woman, the lady cursed him. But this is, of course, a legend. And in total, Gumilev brought from his 1913 expedition many ethnographic objects, more than 100 ethnographic objects, and glass negatives of his pictures, and 4 paintings by Ethiopian artists. Upon returning, he immediately donated the collection to the Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography. And during all his 3 trips to Africa, Gumilev collected samples of Abyssinian folk poetry. In this, he was helped by the African authorities, Russian and foreign diplomats, as well as guides from local residents. Gumilev translated some folk songs into Russian using the French interlinear translation, which was compiled for him by some guides and translators. When he returned, he presented some of these translations to the literary community, along with the skins of animals, which he hunted, and examples of African painting. Soon he published a series of his own poems under the mystifying title Abyssinian Songs. Contemporaries, mistaking these poems for translations, praised their bright colors and virgin innocence. But Gumilev himself debunked this myth. In a refutation, he reported that he published Abyssinian songs and they were written independently of the real poetry of the Abyssinians, but he never managed to publish his actual translations of African poetry. The manuscript with 12 poems, his notes and drawings was not published. But here we see, at this picture, we see how Nikolai Gumilev records songs from the words of an Oromo singer. A translator stands nearby in Ethiopia in 1913. Importantly, Gumilev created the most romantic and attractive image of Africa and its nature and cultures, inspiring many people afterwards to visit and see the continent. And he wrote definitely brilliant poems about Africa, which are well known in Russia and abroad. Now I would like to say about Russian scientists and travelers which visited Africa and helped discover the continent. Russian travelers made a significant contribution to the study of Africa. In the mid-30s of the 19th century, Orientalist and writer Abraham Norov headed to Northeast Africa. He climbed up the Nile to the Second Cataracts and gave a detailed description of his travels in the book Travels Through Egypt and Nubia in 1834-1835, published in St. Petersburg. Also, one of the first explorers of the interior Africa was a Russian mining engineer, diplomat, and talented writer, Colonel Colonel Yegor Kovalevsky. He was invited by the ruler of Egypt to carry out geological research into gold deposits in the area between the White and Blue Nile rivers in the spurs of the Abyssinian mountain, Ethiopian highlands. In 1848, Kovalevsky and his companions from Cairo took a steamer up the Nile to Aswan, where the flow at that time was blocked by the rapids, cataracts. Having bypassed the rapids on dry land, they again moved along the Nile in sailing barges. They crossed the northern tropic, and it was January, but the sun burned mercilessly, he wrote in his diary. Then they rode camels through the Nubian desert to Khartoum with great difficulty. And they faced the shortage of water, and despite the heat and thirst, Kovalevsky conducted continuous scientific observations and measured altitudes with the barometer. Finally, after an exhausting journey through the desert, the travelers saw a strip of water. It was Nile, and a village surrounded by palm grove could be seen not far away. Having rested, the caravan again moved along the banks of the Nile to Berber, from which they again sailed along the river, and after they arrived in Khartoum. After stopping Khartoum, they sailed up the Blue Nile, and Kovalevsky described this part of the journey as follows. A fair wind carried our small flotilla quickly along the waves of the Blue Nile, on which the Russian flag fluttered for the first time. Here the tropical world of animals and plants revealed itself to the travelers in all its originality, and the nature was the complete opposite of the dead Nubian desert. Having left the Blue Nile, travelers headed to the valley of the tributary of the Blue Nile, the Tumat River. The vastness of the Abyssinian mountains rose on the horizon, and Kovalevsky mapped Russian geographical names in this remote and unexplored region of Africa. He named rivers like Nevka, the Nevka, Bezымянная, Georgievskaya. In the upper reaches of the river Tumat, Kovalevsky discovered gold deposits. He described his expedition in the book Journey to Inner Africa. The book was published in 1849 in St. Petersburg. It is written vividly and contains valuable geographical, ethnographic, historical, and natural scientific information, sketches of nature and the life of the population. Also, the famous Russian traveler Nikolai Miklucha-Maklai began his research in Africa. He traveled to the Canary Islands, visited Morocco, the Red Sea, Eritrea, and the Eastern Sudan. In the 70s and 80s of the 19th century, Russian explorer Vasily Junker traveled through the Central Africa. He was a doctor by training, but devoted his life to geographical research. In 1869, he traveled to the island of Iceland, and in subsequent years participated in an archaeological expedition to Northwest Africa. Working in Berlin with the famous geographer Hibbert, Juncker became acquainted with the methods of geographical research, and at the International Geographical Congress in Paris in 1875, he met many African researchers who advised him to study the watershed between the Nile and the Congo River basins in eastern Sudan. So he began his first trip to Africa by sailing the Red Sea, then with a caravan headed to the city of Khartoum, located at the confluence of the White and Blue Nile. Sailing along the lower reaches of the right tributary of the White Nile, Sabato, Juncker made ethnographic, hydrological, and meteorological observations and described the flora and fauna. Juncker explored the equatorial province of Sudan. He drew the detailed maps of the area, and in addition, he discovered the sources of another river. Juncker devoted his second and last trip to Africa in 1879 to finding out which basin of the Uele River belongs to. This was unknown at his time. He also made another maps, and this journey lasted 7 years and was interrupted due to the outbreak of the National Liberation Uprising of the Sudanese people against the British colonialists, and he then returned to Africa. His works are important for science, especially his research in ethnography. He also filmed the areas which he visited. Upon his return to Russia, he was elected an honorary member of the Russian Geographical Society. And after 1887, he settled in Vienna, where he prepared for publication his major work in 3 volumes, Travels in Africa. Also, one of the famous travelers to Africa was Dr. Alexander Yeliseyev, and in 1881, 1893, he made several trips to Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Ethiopia alone, or with one guide. He walked hundreds of miles carrying his own luggage. In the most difficult conditions, he carried out extensive scientific work in anthropology and ethnography. He described his travels in a well-illustrated book Around the World. He collected interesting materials about the nature of deserts. In Soviet times, a large expedition to Ethiopia was organized in 1926-1927. All-Union Institute of Plant Growing of the USSR Academy of Sciences, headed by the academician Nikolai Vavilov, this expedition caravan traveled 2,000 kilometers across Ethiopia and collected up to 6,000 samples of cultivated plants. Also, the examples of soils and farming techniques were studied in detail. Nikolai Vavilov established that the Abyssinian highlands was the center of origin of durum wheat and special types of barley, and that Ethiopia had an exceptional diversity of cultivated plant species unknown outside its borders. Importantly, many Soviet scientists took part in international geological, botanical, and other congresses, and in connection with this, visited different regions of Africa. Geological, geomorphological, and soil botanical observations were carried out. Scientist Ivan Gerasimov made conclusions about the processes of soil formation in dry climates. In 1968-1970, a group of Soviet geographers, Kapitsa, Dobrovolsky, and others, worked in East Africa, conducting geomorphological, geological, tectonic, and geophysical research. The expedition explored the East African geological structure, relief, and other natural components. And in general, the Soviet scientists has always shown and continue to show great interest to the African continent and provide support to the peoples of Africa. At that time, at the Soviet time, it was support in the development of science and also in struggle for national independence. And so Soviet scientists made their contribution to the study of the nature and natural resources of various regions of Africa. Now I would like to say about some prominent figures, some prominent Africans in Russia. Perhaps one of the most amazing figures is Abram Petrovich Gannibal. He was the black person. He was born in a distant African homeland south of the Sahara Desert near the Lagoon River, and he is the first known African in Russia. He was enslaved by the Turkish, but after he was bought by the Russian merchant and diplomat Sava Roguzinsky, he brought the boy to Russia, And there he was baptized in the Orthodox faith. And Peter the Great, the Russian Tsar, was himself became the godfather of a noble child, and he invited the Polish queen Christiana to be his godmother. The king changed the godson's native name, Ibrahim, into Abram, and the boy received the surname in honor of the legendary commander of African Carthage, Hannibal. Over time, Ibrahim Abram became an ally of the king. Until 1716, he was inseparably with Peter the Great, accompanying him in all military campaigns. And later, Abram Gannibal studied in France. He received a brilliant education. He studied military science and naval science, and even he was asked by the French to stay in France, but he chose to return to Russia. And then he made a brilliant career in Russia. He was a military general, and he had a long and interesting life. It is interesting detail that he retired with an important task from the Empress to cultivate potatoes imported from America, adapting them to the Russian climate, so that they would become a help for the constantly malnourished Russian peasants. And Abram Petrovich coped with the task brilliantly. His estate included vast potato fields, and he distributed potatoes during the famine year. The peasants tasted them and recognized them as a good substitute to other food. Over time, potatoes became one of the most important crops in many regions of the Russian Empire. It is also interesting that Abram Gannibal's son, Ivan Gannibal, also made a brilliant career in Russia. He received brilliant education. He participated in wars with Turkey and made many military victories. Therefore, he later was awarded the title of Major General of the Russian Army, and he founded and built a Russian city, which is now known as Kherson, at the south borders of the Russian Empire, and therefore he entered the history of the Russian Empire primarily as the creator of this city. Thanks to his enthusiasm, calculation, and ability to plan, Ivan Abramovich Gannibal built a new city within 3 years with a palace, admiralty, arsenal, shipyards, and private houses. The fortress around which it was built was equipped with a garrison and 200 guns. Various ships were built at the shipyard. Military and merchant ships were located in the harbor, and foreign trading houses were founded in the city. To do this, Gannibal not only brought 5,000 workers from the Russian provinces, but also invited many Greek and Italian specialists living on the Black Sea coast. Ivan Abramovich Gannibal can rightfully be considered the founding father of the city of Kherson. Sorry. In general, my presentation is almost over, and I would like to say that many, of course, in the Soviet times, the exploration of the African continent continued, and many Soviet artists and Soviet writers and they contributed to the exploration and description of Africa, and can you see the presentation?
Да, Ольга Сергеевна, видим презентацию.
In general, my presentation is almost over here, so I would like to give time to answer the questions if there are any questions from the audience.
Ольга Сергеевна, спасибо большое. Вот, да, в чате уже спрашивают, можем ли мы поделиться презентацией. We have a question about whether we could share the presentation with those who are interested. And I think, yes, of course, we will share the presentation and send it through our emails. Yes, so if you would like to get it, you'll have the chance. И у нас был такой вопрос, как вы считаете, как связано исследование Африки, да, и поездки с тем, как развивались отношения в будущем между Россией и Африкой? Повлияло ли это?
I will respond in English. Yeah. Of course, these travels by Russian scientists and travelers, they led the foundation of the further exploration and investigation and studies of the African continent during the Soviet times. And of course, the Soviet time travels and research, they led the foundation for what Russian scientists do now in Africa. And for example, geological research gave, in Soviet times, geological research was brilliant, and many findings made in those times, they are still valuable, and this research is continued by Российско-африканских, Olga, for example, and many scientists like ethnographers and geographers and biologists, they visit Africa nowadays, and they organize expeditions. And as far as I know, there is like continuous expedition in Ethiopia by Russian scientists with their Ethiopian colleagues, as well as in many other fields like marine research. That is also it is continued by the Russian scientists, and also the culture of the African peoples, the African languages, they are taught in several Russian universities, and the Russian scientists still continue to analyze African literature, make translations. So this is continued, of course.
Thank you very much. And I would like to say that we have participants from Zambia, Madagascar, Uganda, Eswatini, from Uzbekistan that are watching our meeting. So greetings from St. Petersburg, from Moscow. And Olga Sергeyevna, could you say a few words about the next our meeting that is going to be in 1 week, and what are we going to discuss there?
In 1 week, we are going to discuss the actual state of the Russian-African relations, business ties, social ties, economic economic interaction, political landmarks, as well as the outcomes of the 2 Russia-African summits in 2019 and 2023. And I will proceed on several landmark projects between Russia and African countries, and any issues of interest to Africa and Russia at the current stage.
Thank you. And we have a question in our chat. The paintings from Tunisia are predominantly of Black people. Why has this changed in contemporary times?
I think Kuzma Petrov-Vodkin, he met various peoples in Tunisia, because the population was mixed also at that time. And there was there were Black people. There were probably not a Black population also, but I think he depicted mainly Black people because of his interest in this Black culture. Of course, through the time, the population of Tunisia may have changed, but I cannot say exactly why this has changed. It needs additional research in this topic, so definitely I cannot say, because I think this was of his interest, because of his interest to this Black culture. That's why he depicted them, although he may have met other African peoples in his travels, not Black people.
Yes, thank you. So if you have questions, you can write them and we'll try to answer them. And I just want to share that the next meeting is going to be in 1 week on the 19th of September. And but before that, we're going to have the first meeting with the students who would like to study Russian, and it's going to be on Thursday, on the 14th of September. All the information will be sent to our WhatsApp chat and Telegram channel, and as well, you will get the information on your emails. So if you have friends or people that are interested in Russian language and would like to know how to start, what sources there is to study language, and please join us on the first meeting on this Thursday. So there is no questions so far. Olga Sergeyevna, would you like to add something before we end this first meeting?
I would like, first of all, thank you for your attention to my presentation. And I would like to say that the topic of Africa in Russian culture and in Russian science, indeed, it is very big, and you can explore it in detail for a long time, and you will always learn something new, because it is definitely a lot has been done by the Russian cultural figures, by the Russian scientists, to travel to Africa, to describe Africa. And many Russian people, all of them who visited Africa, they were fascinated by the African continent, and they expressed their fascination in various forms, in the forms of pictures, in the form of poems, books, even fantastic books, and even scientific descriptions, like many volumes of scientific research. Many Russian cultural figures collected artifacts from Africa, and I know many scientists who like these African paintings, like African sculptures, and they collect them, like African dresses and even shoes. So this is of great interest to Russians, and it was always like that, because Africa was like a land of mystery, many like of the beginning of civilizations, like some of them in the earlier times considered like in Adam, like where the life on Earth began, and therefore they would like to explore it in more detail. So this is definitely like a big topic in Russian culture and in Russian science, the African continent. And there are, of course, many more names in the Russian culture and in the Russian science to be named here, but due to the shortage of time, I just picked up some of them and gave a broad, like a short overview of this Russian footprint in this field.
Thank you, Olga Sергeyevna. Do we have museums where you can find collected African artifacts?
I guess in the Museum of Eastern Cultures in Moscow, and Egyptian collections can be found in the State Museum of Fine Arts named after Pushkin, and also in St. Petersburg, I think in the Ponskamera Institute of Ethnography and Anthropology, there are some collections of African art, and there are also private collections of diplomats. I know some about some of them. From time to time, they are exhibited. And also here we also like exhibitions of works of African artists, and many Russian people collect them, these paintings.
Ольга Сергеевна, спасибо большое за нашу встречу. Ольга Сергеевна, thank you very much for this meeting. I hope that this is the very beginning of our cooperation, of our project, and I do hope that it's going to deepen the connection between Russia and African cultures. And please join us on the next webinar, and you can find all the themes of the webinars on our website. I also send you the link to the website so you can plan our meeting. Olga Sergeyevna, thank you very much, and see you on Tuesday.
Thank you for your attention. See you on Tuesday.